The sound of Alexander Kane's Italian leather shoes against marble echoed through the 42nd floor of the Kane Tower like gunshots, each step a declaration of power that made lesser mortals step aside. At 32, he commanded an empire worth $3 billion, and everyone in his path knew it. "Thompson, those quarterly reports better be on my desk in 10 minutes, or you'll be explaining to unemployment why you can't meet a deadline." Alexander barked into his phone, not bothering to slow his stride as he approached the executive suite. His charcoal Armani suit was immaculate, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his green eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had never known defeat. The glass doors to his office suite whispered open, revealing the pristine domain where Alexander Kane ruled his technological kingdom. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Seattle's skyline, while minimalist furniture and cutting-edge displays showcased the latest innovations from Kane Enterprises. Everything was sterile, perfect, and utterly devoid of human warmth. Behind her desk in the outer office sat Sophia Hale, 28 years old, and invisible in the way that only highly competent assistants could manage. Her oversized glasses reflected the glow of her computer screen as her fingers flew across the keyboard, responding to emails that would have taken most people hours to compose. Her conservative navy blazer and modest pencil skirt were chosen specifically to blend into the background, and her beautiful dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that revealed nothing of her true allure. "Coffee," Alexander commanded without looking at her, already focused on the stack of contracts awaiting his signature. "The real stuff, not that swill from the break room." "Already brewing, Mr. Kane," Sophia replied in her professional tone, never lifting her eyes from her screen. "Your 10:30 with the Singapore team has been moved to 11:15 due to technical difficulties on their end. I've rescheduled your lunch with the venture capitalists accordingly, and the presentation materials for this afternoon's board meeting are ready for your review." Alexander paused for a fraction of a second, mildly impressed despite himself, then continued into his office. This was their routine, polished by 2 years of working together. She anticipated his needs with an efficiency that bordered on telepathic, managed his impossible schedule with the precision of a Swiss timepiece, and somehow made his chaotic business empire run like clockwork. In return, he paid her well, and largely pretended she didn't exist as anything more than a particularly sophisticated piece of office equipment. The morning progressed with its usual intensity. Alexander tore through 3 conference calls, eviscerated a marketing proposal that he deemed catastrophically stupid, and negotiated a hostile takeover that would net Kane Enterprises another $100 million in annual revenue. Through it all, Sophia worked silently in the outer office, fielding calls, managing crises, and ensuring that Alexander's day proceeded without the slightest inconvenience. It was during his lunch break, while reviewing the latest quarterly projections, that disaster struck in the form of Victor Lang and Edward Finch, 2 of his oldest business associates and current partners in a lucrative defense contract. "Alexander, you magnificent bastard." Victor boomed as he strode into the office without announcement, his silver hair gleaming, and his expensive suit doing little to hide his considerable gut. Edward followed close behind, tall and thin, with the predatory smile of a man who'd built his fortune on other people's misery. "Gentlemen," Alexander stood, extending his hand with the practiced ease of someone who'd been schmoozing since childhood. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" "The Pinnacle Awards Gala, of course," Edward said, settling into one of the leather chairs facing Alexander's desk. 3 weeks away, and the most important networking event of the year. I trust you've secured an appropriately stunning date." Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The Pinnacle Awards were indeed crucial, a black-tie affair where Seattle's business elite gathered to celebrate technological innovation and, more importantly, to make deals worth billions. Last year, he'd attended with Isabella Vargas, a supermodel whose beauty had been matched only by her complete lack of intellectual substance. The relationship had ended badly when she'd sold details of their private conversations to a gossip magazine. "I'm considering my options," Alexander replied smoothly, though internally he was cursing. In the chaos of recent business acquisitions, he'd completely forgotten about securing a date for the gala. Victor chuckled. The sound unpleasant, and knowing. "Ah, the eternal bachelor. You know, Edward and I were just discussing your romantic life, or rather the lack thereof." It's becoming quite the topic of conversation in certain circles. Is it now? Alexander's voice carried a dangerous edge that would have warned smarter men to tread carefully. Edward, however, was not a smart man when it came to reading social cues. Oh yes, quite the speculation. Some say you prefer the company of men. Others suggest you're simply too intimidated by intelligent women to pursue them. There's even a betting pool about whether you'll show up to the gala alone again. The insult hit its mark with surgical precision. Alexander's reputation was everything in his world. It determined business partnerships, secured investments, and maintained the respect that kept his empire intact. The suggestion that he was either gay or too weak to attract a worthy woman was exactly the kind of poison that could undermine everything he'd built. Intimidated. Alexander's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Gentlemen, I could have any woman in this city. I simply choose not to waste my time on the usual vapid socialites. Then prove it. Victor leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. Bring someone extraordinary to the gala. Someone who will make every man in that room burn with envy. Alexander's mind raced through possibilities. His usual circle of potential companions were all variations on the same theme. Beautiful, wealthy, and ultimately forgettable. He needed someone who would make a statement. Someone unexpected who would demonstrate his power to command the impossible. The soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Mr. Kane. Sophia's voice was barely audible through the heavy wood. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Singapore team is ready for your conference call. Come in, Alexander called. An idea beginning to form in his mind with the slow, inevitable certainty of an avalanche. Sophia entered with her usual quiet efficiency, tablet in hand, her attention focused on business. In her conservative clothing and severe hairstyle, she looked like every other overworked assistant in corporate America. But Alexander found himself studying her with new eyes, noting the graceful way she moved, the intelligence that sparkled behind her glasses, the quiet dignity that he'd been too blind to see. Tell them, I'll be with them in 5 minutes, he said, his voice carrying an odd undertone that made Sophia glance at him with surprise. Of course, sir, she replied, turning to leave. And Sophia, Alexander's voice stopped her at the door. Clear your calendar for the evening of the 23rd. She turned back, confusion evident in her expression. The 23rd, sir? Is there a late meeting I should prepare for? Alexander smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression that made both Victor and Edward lean forward with interest. In a manner of speaking, you'll be accompanying me to the Pinnacle Awards Gala. The silence that followed was deafening. Sophia's eyes widened behind her glasses, her tablet nearly slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. Victor and Edward exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of Alexander's assistant. 2. Not sure I understand, Mr. Kane, Sophia stammered, her professional composure cracking for the first time in Alexander's memory. It's quite simple, Alexander said, enjoying the shock on everyone's faces. You'll be my date for the evening. I trust that won't be a problem. Sophia's mind reeled as she tried to process what was happening. Alexander Kane, the man who barely acknowledged her existence, who treated her like a piece of office furniture, who had never shown the slightest interest in her as a human being, was asking her to accompany him to the most exclusive social event in Seattle's business calendar. That is, she struggled to find words, acutely aware of the two strangers watching her with undisguised amusement. I don't think I would be appropriate for such an event, sir. Nonsense. Alexander waved away her objections with casual arrogance. You're intelligent, professional, and certainly presentable. That's more than I can say for most of the women who attend these functions. The casual cruelty of his assessment, reducing her to a list of basic qualifications while simultaneously insulting an entire gender, reminded Sophia exactly why she'd been planning to update her resume. Working for Alexander Kane was like being trapped in a beautiful golden cage with a particularly magnificent and unpredictable tiger. But there was something else in his expression, something she couldn't quite identify. Was it desperation? Surely not. Alexander Kane didn't do desperation. Think of it as overtime, Alexander continued when she didn't respond immediately. The gala is in 3 weeks. I'll compensate you appropriately for your time. Naturally. And there it was. The final insult that crystallized everything Sophia had been feeling for months. He wasn't asking her as a man asking a woman. He wasn't even asking her as a human being. He was giving her an assignment, another task to add to her endless list of responsibilities in service to his ego. "Of course, Mr. Kane," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral despite the storm of emotions raging beneath the surface. "I'll make sure to clear my schedule." "Excellent." Alexander turned back to his business associates, already dismissing her from his thoughts. "Gentlemen, I believe that settles your concerns about my social life." Victor and Edward were still chuckling as Sophia left the office, their conversation immediately turning to speculation about Alexander's chances of success with such an unremarkable companion. Their voices followed her as she closed the door, but their words were lost beneath the pounding of her heart and the sudden, fierce determination that was building in her chest. Alexander Kane thought he was playing a game, using her as a pawn in whatever power struggle he was engaged in with his colleagues. He expected her to show up as his dowdy assistant to provide a few hours of mild entertainment before returning to her designated role as invisible support staff. But as Sophia settled back at her desk and reached for her phone to call her best friend Zoe, she was already imagining a very different kind of evening. Alexander Kane was about to learn that underestimating Sophia Hale was the biggest mistake of his privileged, arrogant life. The game was about to change, and she intended to win. Chapter 2. The Transformation. 3 weeks had never passed so slowly in Alexander Kane's life. Yet somehow, the day of the Pinnacle Awards Gala arrived with the shocking swiftness of an execution date. He stood in his penthouse bathroom, adjusting his black bow tie for the third time, while trying to ignore the strange knot of anxiety that had taken residence in his stomach. The reflection staring back at him from the mirror was everything it should be. Perfectly groomed, dark hair, immaculate tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars, green eyes that had charmed investors out of billions. So why did he feel like he was about to walk into a disaster of his own making? The Armani tuxedo fit him like liquid obsidian, the crisp white shirt a stark contrast against his tanned skin. His cufflinks were platinum and emerald, a gift from a grateful Saudi prince whose tech infrastructure Alexander had revolutionized. Every detail was perfect, calculated to project power and success to the 500 most influential people in Seattle's business community. But as he reached for his cologne, Alexander found himself wondering what Sophia was wearing. He'd increased her clothing allowance and given her the day off to prepare, but beyond that, he'd left the details to her. It was, after all, just a business arrangement. She would show up in something appropriate but unremarkable. They would make their appearance, and by Monday morning, life would return to normal. The doorbell of his penthouse chimed at exactly 7 o'clock, and Alexander checked his watch with approval. Whatever else could be said about Sophia, she was punctual to a fault. He strode across the marble floors of his living room, past the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased Seattle's glittering skyline, and opened the door with a polite smile already in place. The smile died on his lips. The woman standing in his doorway bore no resemblance to the dowdy assistant who had worked outside his office for 2 years. Gone were the oversized glasses, replaced by contacts that revealed eyes the color of warm chocolate, almond-shaped and lined with subtle kohl that made them appear enormous and mysterious. Her hair, freed from its usual severe bun, cascaded over her shoulders in glossy waves that caught the light like black silk. But it was the dress that stopped Alexander's heart entirely. She wore a gown of midnight blue that seemed to have been poured over her curves like liquid starlight. The dress was elegant rather than revealing, with a high neckline that skimmed her throat and long sleeves that hugged her arms, but every line of it whispered of hidden sensuality. It fell to the floor in a pool of silk that rustled when she moved, and when she turned slightly to adjust her small clutch, Alexander caught a glimpse of the dress's only concession to drama, a deep V that plunged nearly to the small of her back, revealing skin like polished mahogany. "Good evening, Mr. Kane," Sophia said, her voice carrying the same professional tone she used in the office, though there was something different underneath it, now confidence, perhaps, or maybe challenge. Alexander realized he'd been staring for an embarrassingly long time and forced his mouth to close. "Sophia," he managed, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "You look different." She smiled, and even that was transformed. Her usual careful, professional expression had been replaced by something radiant and genuine that lit up her entire face. "Thank you. I hope this is appropriate for the occasion." "Appropriate." Alexander nearly laughed at the understatement. She looked like a goddess who had decided to walk among mortals for her own amusement. Every man at the gala would want her, and every woman would either hate her or want to be her. "It's perfect," he said, finally remembering his manners. "Shall we go?" The ride in Alexander's Bentley was an exercise in carefully controlled tension. Sophia sat beside him in the leather seat, the silk of her dress whispering with every movement, her perfume, something sophisticated and intoxicating that he'd never smelled before filling the confined space. Alexander found himself stealing glances at her profile, noting details he'd never bothered to observe before. The elegant line of her neck, the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheekbones, the graceful way her hands rested in her lap. "I should probably warn you," he said as they neared the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. "There will be photographers, business press mostly, but they'll want pictures." "I understand," Sophia replied calmly. "I've researched the guest list and familiarized myself with the major players who will be attending. I assume you'll want me to be charming, but not too memorable, professional, but not boring." Alexander turned to look at her fully, surprised by her thoroughness. "You researched the guest list. Of course. This is important for your business relationships, isn't it?" "I would hardly attend without proper preparation." She smoothed her skirt with hands that betrayed no nervousness whatsoever. "I've read up on current tech trends, market fluctuations, and recent merger activity. I can discuss artificial intelligence applications, cryptocurrency regulation, or sustainable energy innovations if necessary." For a moment, he was speechless. He'd invited her as arm candy, a beautiful prop to demonstrate his desirability to his colleagues. It had never occurred to him that she might approach the evening with the same intellectual rigor she brought to everything else. "Sophia," he began, then stopped, unsure what he wanted to say. The Bentley pulled up to the hotel's entrance, where a red carpet stretched beneath glittering lights, and photographers clustered like elegant vultures. Through the tinted windows, Alexander could see the parade of Seattle's elite making their grand entrances, designer gowns, and expensive tuxedos, creating a river of wealth and ambition. "Mr. Kane." Sophia's voice was gentle, and when he looked at her, he saw something that might have been concern in her eyes. "Are you ready?" Alexander took a deep breath, suddenly feeling like he was about to step into something far more complicated than he'd bargained for. "Let's do this." The hotel doorman opened Sophia's door first, and Alexander watched from inside the car as she emerged with fluid grace, the cameras immediately flashing as photographers tried to identify this stunning unknown woman. She paused for just a moment, allowing them to capture her image, then waited patiently for Alexander to join her. When he stepped out and offered her his arm, the reaction was immediate and electric. Whispers rippled through the crowd of onlookers and media representatives as they tried to place the beautiful woman on Alexander Kane's arm. "Alexander," a photographer called out, "who's your lovely companion?" "This is Miss Sophia Hale," Alexander replied smoothly, his hand warm on her back as he guided her toward the entrance. "My partner for the evening." "Partner." The word slipped out before he could stop it, and he felt Sophia's slight hesitation in her step. He'd meant to say date or even just friend, but somehow partner felt more accurate, more honest. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic had been transformed into a technological wonderland for the evening. Holographic displays showcased the latest innovations from Seattle's tech community, while servers in sleek uniforms circulated with champagne and canapés. The city's business elite clustered in groups, their conversations a mixture of social pleasantries and multi-million-dollar negotiations. Alexander guided Sophia through the crowd, introducing her to colleagues and clients with growing amazement at her performance. She was charming without being flirtatious, intelligent without being intimidating, and somehow managed to make each person feel as though they were the most interesting individual in the room. Miss Hale, Mayor Eleanor Grant, extended her hand with genuine warmth. "I understand you work in the technology sector." "I'm in business development," Sophia replied smoothly, accepting the handshake with perfect poise. "It's fascinating work, especially with all the innovations happening in sustainable tech right now. I imagine the city is exploring quite a few green energy initiatives. As Sophia and the mayor launched into an intelligent discussion about municipal renewable energy programs, Alexander found himself watching her with growing fascination. This wasn't the quiet, invisible assistant who managed his schedule and answered his phones. This was a woman of substance, wit, and undeniable charisma, who had somehow been hiding in plain sight. "My God, Alexander," a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find Damien Croft approaching, his rival's pale blue eyes fixed hungrily on Sophia. "Where have you been hiding this absolute vision?" Damien was everything Alexander despised about their industry. Old money pretending to be new tech, inherited wealth masquerading as earned success. At 35, he ran Croft Digital with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences for failure. He was also devastatingly handsome in a classical way that attracted women like moths to a flame, and had been nursing a grudge against Alexander ever since losing a major government contract to Kane Enterprises the previous year. "Damien," Alexander's voice carried a warning edge. "I'd like you to meet Sophia Hale." Damien took Sophia's hand and brought it halfway to his lips in an old-fashioned gesture that made Alexander's jaw clench. "Miss Hale, you are absolutely radiant. Would you honor me with a dance?" Sophia glanced at Alexander, and for a moment, he saw something flicker in her expression. Was she asking permission, or was she testing him? "I'd be delighted," she said finally, allowing Damien to lead her onto the dance floor. Alexander watched as Damien pulled Sophia into his arms, his hands positioned with perfect propriety, but his smile carrying unmistakable intent. They moved together beautifully, Sophia's grace evident in every step, her laugh carrying across the ballroom as Damien whispered something undoubtedly charming in her ear. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Kane experienced pure, unadulterated jealousy. It hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his hands clench into fists. The sight of another man's hands on Sophia, another man making her smile, another man being the focus of her attention, it was unbearable. "She's quite lovely." Victor Lang appeared at Alexander's elbow, his voice carrying smug satisfaction. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised you chose someone so accessible. Usually, your companions are a bit more exclusive." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Victor was suggesting that Sophia was somehow beneath Alexander's usual standards, that she was common rather than exceptional. The comment ignited something dangerous in Alexander's chest. "Careful, Victor." Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. "You're talking about my date." On the dance floor, Damien was leaning closer to Sophia, his lips near her ear as he said something that made her throw back her head and laugh with genuine delight. The sound hit Alexander like a punch to the solar plexus. He couldn't take any more. Alexander strode onto the dance floor with the single-minded determination of a man claiming what was his. Damien looked up as he approached, his smile faltering at whatever he saw in Alexander's expression. "Mind if I cut in?" Alexander asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a question. Damien's arms loosened reluctantly around Sophia. "Of course. Miss Hale, thank you for the lovely dance. I do hope we'll have another opportunity later." As Damien retreated, Alexander pulled Sophia into his arms and immediately felt the rightness of it. She fit against him perfectly, her hand warm in his, her body moving in perfect synchronization with his own. The jealousy that had been eating at him like acid began to fade, replaced by something deeper and infinitely more dangerous. "Having fun?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Sophia looked up at him, her eyes unreadable in the ballroom's romantic lighting. "It's been enlightening." "How so?" She was quiet for a moment, and Alexander found himself holding his breath as he waited for her answer. When she spoke, her voice was soft but filled with something that might have been disappointment. "I think I'm beginning to understand why you invited me tonight." The statement hit Alexander like cold water, washing away the warmth of holding her and replacing it with sharp awareness of his own motivations. She was right, of course. He had invited her to prove a point, to demonstrate his desirability and power to colleagues who had questioned his romantic capabilities. But looking down at her now, Seeing the intelligence and dignity and quiet strength that he'd been too blind to notice before, Alexander realized that somewhere during the evening, his motivations had shifted entirely. He was no longer thinking about Victor and Edward, no longer concerned with proving anything to anyone else. All he could think about was the woman in his arms, the way her skin glowed in the candlelight, the way her laugh had made him feel when Damien had earned it, and the way she was looking at him now with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Sophia," he began, but she shook her head slightly. "It's all right, Alexander. I understand what this is." But as they continued to dance, as Alexander felt the warmth of her body against his and breathed in the intoxicating scent of her perfume, he realized that he didn't understand what this was at all. What had started as a calculated move in a game of corporate politics had become something else entirely, something that made his chest tight and his hands shake and his carefully ordered world tilt on its axis. The song ended, but Alexander didn't let her go. They stood there in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by Seattle's elite, but aware only of each other. While something fundamental shifted between them, Alexander Kane was falling, and for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to stop. Chapter 3. The Awakening. The rest of the Pinnacle Awards Gala passed in a blur of champagne toasts, industry speeches, and carefully orchestrated networking, but Alexander Kane was aware of nothing beyond the woman at his side. Sophia had transformed from invisible assistant to the undisputed queen of the evening, and Alexander found himself mesmerized by this revelation of her true self. She moved through conversations with the grace of a diplomat, discussing quantum computing advances with tech CEOs, debating environmental policy with government officials, and somehow making the mayor's notoriously difficult wife laugh until tears ran down her cheeks. "Your Miss Hale is quite remarkable," Senator Margaret Cole commented as they watched Sophia expertly navigate a discussion about cybersecurity legislation with a group of defense contractors. "Where on earth did you find her?" Alexander's response died in his throat as he realized the truth. He hadn't found Sophia at all. She had been right there beside him for 2 years, managing his life with quiet competence, while he remained completely oblivious to her brilliance. The thought made him feel like the worst kind of fool. "She's been with my company for some time," he replied carefully, his eyes never leaving Sophia's animated face as she made a point about encryption protocols. "Though I'm beginning to realize I've never given her the recognition she deserves." The senator raised an eyebrow at the admission, but before she could respond, Damien Croft materialized at Alexander's elbow like a persistent shadow. "Alexander, old friend." Damien's smile was all teeth and predatory charm. "I hope you won't mind if I steal Miss Hale for another dance. We were having such a fascinating conversation about artificial intelligence applications in financial markets." Alexander's jaw clenched involuntarily. Throughout the evening, Damien had circled Sophia like a shark scenting blood, finding excuses to approach her whenever Alexander's attention was diverted by business conversations. Each interaction had been perfectly polite and professional, but Alexander could read the hunger in Damien's eyes as clearly as a neon sign. Actually, Alexander stepped closer to Sophia, his hand settling possessively on the small of her back, where her dress revealed warm, smooth skin. "I was hoping to get some air. Sophia, would you join me on the terrace?" Sophia looked between the two men, and Alexander saw her taking in the subtle tension crackling between them. Her lips curved in what might have been amusement, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "That sounds lovely," she said, accepting Alexander's offered arm. "Mr. Croft, perhaps we can continue our discussion another time." Damien's smile never wavered, but Alexander caught the flash of irritation in his pale eyes. "Of course, I'll look forward to it." The hotel's terrace overlooked Elliott Bay, where the lights of distant ferries moved across dark water like fallen stars. The November air was crisp but not unpleasant, carrying the salt scent of the Sound and the distant sound of traffic from the streets below. Most of the gala attendees had remained inside where it was warm, leaving Alexander and Sophia virtually alone among the elegant outdoor furniture and carefully maintained garden spaces. "Beautiful night," Sophia commented, moving to the stone railing that bordered the terrace. The city lights reflected in her dark eyes, and the breeze stirred her hair in a way that made Alexander's chest tight. "Yes," he agreed. though he wasn't looking at the view. "Sophia, I owe you an apology." She turned to face him, surprise flickering across her features. "For what?" Alexander struggled to find words for the realization that had been building throughout the evening. "For not seeing you, for treating you like office furniture, instead of recognizing the extraordinary woman you are." A shadow crossed Sophia's face, and she looked away from him, back toward the sparkling cityscape. "Is that what this evening has been about? You finally noticing that your assistant cleans up well?" The question stung because it was partially true, but Alexander realized that his motivations had evolved far beyond his original shallow intentions. "It started that way," he admitted with painful honesty. "When Victor and Edward questioned my ability to attract an exceptional woman, inviting you seemed like an easy way to prove them wrong." Sophia's shoulders stiffened, and Alexander saw hurt flash across her expression before she carefully schooled her features back to neutrality. "I see. Well, I hope I've been an adequate prop for your ego tonight." "Damit?" "No." Alexander moved closer, his voice urgent. "That's not what I mean. Yes, I invited you to make a point, but Sophia, watching you tonight, seeing how brilliant and gracious and captivating you are, I realize I've been a blind idiot for 2 years." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Alexander, you don't have to flatter me. I understand exactly what this is. You needed a presentable woman for an important business function, and I happened to be convenient. I dressed the part, played my role, and tomorrow we'll go back to our normal professional relationship, where you bark orders and I follow them." The casual dismissal of what he was feeling hit Alexander like a physical blow. He reached out without thinking, his hands settling gently on her bare shoulders, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath his palms. "Look at me," he said softly, and after a moment's hesitation, she did. "I'm not flattering you. I'm trying to apologize for being too arrogant and stupid to see what was right in front of me. You're not convenient, Sophia. You're extraordinary." Something flickered in her eyes, hope perhaps, or maybe just confusion. "Alexander, Damien Croft isn't wrong to pursue you," Alexander continued, his thumbs unconsciously stroking along her collarbones. "Any man would be a fool not to see how remarkable you are, but the thought of him touching you, making you laugh, being the one who gets to see you smile, it's driving me insane." Sophia's breath caught, and Alexander felt the slight tremor that ran through her body at his words. "You're jealous?" "Completely," he admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. "Irrationally, possessively jealous in a way I've never experienced before. When I saw you dancing with him, laughing at his jokes, I wanted to throw him off the terrace." A smile tugged at the corners of Sophia's mouth, despite her obvious efforts to maintain her composure. "That would have caused quite a scandal." "Worth it," Alexander said immediately, and meant it. "Sophia, I know I have no right to ask this after the way I've treated you, but please don't write this off as just business. Don't write me off." She studied his face in the soft light from the ballroom, searching for something Alexander desperately hoped she would find. "What are you asking me?" Alexander realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. He could retreat now, maintain the professional distance that had defined their relationship, and pretend this evening had been nothing more than a successful business arrangement. Or he could step forward into unknown territory and risk everything he thought he understood about himself. "I'm asking for a chance," he said finally. "A real chance. Not as your boss or as someone who needs arm candy for corporate events, but as a man who's realized he's been falling for his assistant and was too much of an arrogant ass to recognize it." Sophia's eyes widened, and for a moment, Alexander saw his own vulnerability reflected back at him. Then her expression softened into something that made his heart race. "Alexander," she whispered. And the way she said his nomino, Mr. Kane, not Sir, but his actual name spoken with warmth and possibility, made him feel like he could conquer the world. He leaned closer, drawn by forces beyond his control, and saw her eyelashes flutter as she tilted her face up toward his. The space between them seemed charged with electricity, heavy with 2 years of unspoken tension and the revelation of feelings neither had acknowledged until tonight. Alexander's hand moved to cup her face, his thumb tracing the elegant line of her cheekbone. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, giving her one last chance to preserve the boundaries between them. Instead, Sophia rose on her tiptoes, closing the remaining distance between them with a decision that took his breath away. Their first kiss was soft, tentative, a question asked and answered in the space of a heartbeat. Then Alexander's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of desperate longing and newfound understanding. Sophia's hands fisted in the lapels of his tuxedo, anchoring herself as the world tilted around them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers and tried to make sense of the emotions coursing through him. "Sophia," he began. But she placed a finger against his lips. "Don't," she said softly. "Don't say anything that will make this complicated. Not tonight." Alexander caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that made her shiver. "It's already complicated." "I know." She pulled back slightly, studying his face with eyes that held a mixture of hope and weariness. "Alex, I need you to understand something. I'm not some starry-eyed assistant who's been harboring secret fantasies about her boss. If you're looking for someone who'll be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you're willing to throw her way, you're looking at the wrong woman." The statement was delivered with quiet dignity, but Alexander heard the unshakable strength beneath her gentle tone. This wasn't the invisible, compliant assistant he'd taken for granted. This was a woman who knew her own worth and wouldn't settle for less than she deserved. "Good," he said, surprising her. "I don't want grateful or easy. I want you, all of you, exactly as you are." A smile finally broke across Sophia's face, transforming her features with radiant warmth. "Then you'd better be prepared for a challenge, Mr. Kane, because I intend to make you work for it." Alexander laughed, the sound rich with anticipation and joy. "I wouldn't have it any other way." The sound of applause from inside the ballroom reminded them that the evening was drawing to a close, that the real world waited just beyond the magical bubble they'd created on the terrace. But as Alexander offered Sophia his arm and they walked back toward the warmth and light of the gala, he felt like everything in his life had just shifted into perfect focus. For the first time in his 32 years, Alexander Kane was truly, deeply, helplessly in love. And the woman beside him, brilliant, beautiful, challenging Sophia Halejust, might be willing to give him the chance to prove he was worthy of her affection. The game had indeed changed, but Alexander was beginning to realize that what he'd thought was a game had actually been the beginning of the rest of his life. Chapter 4. The Pursuit. The weekend after the Pinnacle Awards Gala arrived with the brutal efficiency of a corporate takeover, and Alexander Kane found himself standing in his office early Monday morning, holding a cup of premium Ethiopian coffee and staring at the door to his assistant's workspace, like a teenager, working up the courage to ask someone to prom. 3 days had passed since the Pinnacle Awards Gala. 3 days since that earth-shattering kiss on the terrace, and Alexander had spent every waking moment replaying the evening in his mind, the feel of Sophia in his arms, the way she'd looked at him with those intelligent dark eyes, the soft warmth of her lips against his. It had consumed his thoughts to the point where he'd barely been able to focus on the most basic business decisions. The drive home from the gala had been charged with unspoken tension and possibility. They'd sat in comfortable silence, Sophia's hand resting in his on the leather seat between them, both seeming to understand that whatever had begun between them needed time to breathe before being examined too closely. When he'd walked her to her apartment door, the goodnight kiss had been sweet and restrained, but it had left Alexander lying awake until dawn, burning with want and something deeper that he was only beginning to recognize. Now, as he waited for Sophia to arrive for their first day back in the office, Alexander felt like he was about to take the most important meeting of his life. The soft chime of the elevator preceded her entrance by exactly 30 seconds. Alexander had learned her patterns well enough to know that she always took precisely that long to walk from the elevator to their suite. But when the outer office door opened and Sophia stepped inside, Alexander's carefully prepared speech died in his throat. She was back in her professional armor, the conservative navy suit, the sensible low heels, the severe bun that tamed her glorious hair into submission. Only the subtle confidence in her bearing and the way she met his gaze directly instead of deferentially indicated that anything had changed between them. "Good morning, Mr. Kane," she said in her perfectly professional tone, settling behind her desk with practiced efficiency. "Your 8 a.m. with the Korean delegation has been moved to 8:30 due to traffic delays from the airport." I've rescheduled your other meetings accordingly, and the Patterson contract is ready for your review." After everything that had passed between them, she was back to the formal address that reminded him of the professional boundary he'd spent 2 years maintaining with ruthless efficiency. Alexander felt something cold settle in his stomach as he wondered if Sophia had decided to pretend the gala had never happened. "Sophia," he said carefully, then caught himself. In the office, she had always been Miss Hale, but after holding her in his arms, after kissing her until they were both breathless, the formal address felt like a betrayal of what had grown between them. She looked up from her computer screen, one elegant eyebrow raised in inquiry. "Yes, sir?" Alexander studied her face, searching for some sign of the woman who had smiled at him under the stars, who had challenged him to work for her affection, who had kissed him with a passion that had rearranged his understanding of what was possible between two people. But Sophia's expression remained politely professional, giving nothing away. "I was hoping we could discuss what happened at the gala," he said finally, his voice carrying more uncertainty than he was comfortable with. "Of course," Sophia replied smoothly. "I believe the evening was quite successful from a business perspective. You made several valuable connections, and the preliminary feedback I've received suggests that your presence with a sophisticated companion helped solidify your reputation among your peers." The clinical assessment of their evening together hit Alexander like a slap-sophisticated companion, as if she were nothing more than a hired escort who had performed her duties adequately. "That's not what I meant," Alexander said, his voice sharpening with frustration. "I'm aware of what you meant." Sophia's tone remained perfectly level, but Alexander caught a flicker of something hurt, weariness, in her eyes. "However, I think it would be best if we maintained our professional relationship. What happened at the gala was pleasant, but it would be inappropriate to let personal feelings interfere with our work environment." "Pleasant?" Alexander felt his temper spike. At the dismissive word, what had happened between them had been earth-shattering, life-changing, the beginning of something he'd never experienced before, and she was calling it pleasant. "Is that what you really want?" he asked, moving closer to her desk, "to pretend that nothing happened between us?" Sophia's fingers stilled on her keyboard, and for a moment, Alexander saw her careful composure crack. When she looked up at him, her eyes held a vulnerability that made his chest ache. "What I want," she said quietly, "and what's realistic are two very different things. You're Alexander Kane. You date supermodels and socialites, women who move in your world naturally. I'm your assistant who had one magical evening playing dress-up. Let's not complicate things by pretending it was anything more." The words were like a knife to Alexander's heart, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how little Sophia believed in her own worth, how little she believed in his capacity to see beyond the shallow expectations his past behavior had created. "You're wrong," he said fiercely, "about all of it, but especially about yourself." Before Sophia could respond, the office door burst open, and Victor Lang strode in with his usual lack of regard for boundaries or appointments. "Alexander, my boy," Victor boomed, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd been proven right. "Heard through the grapevine that your little performance at the gala was quite the success. Managed to fool everyone into thinking you could actually attract a quality woman." Alexander's hands clenched into fists at the insult, but before he could respond, Victor had turned his attention to Sophia with the predatory interest of a man who enjoyed exercising power over those he considered beneath him. "Miss Hale, isn't it? I must say, you cleaned up remarkably well for the evening, though I imagine it must have been quite overwhelming being thrust into such elevated company." Sophia's spine straightened, and Alexander saw a steel flash in her eyes. "Not at all, Mr. Lang. I found the conversation quite stimulating. Your wife's insights into art acquisition were particularly enlightening." Victor's smile faltered slightly at the smooth deflection, but he recovered quickly. "Yes, well, I'm sure it was all very educational for you. Still, I hope you don't harbor any illusions about your little Cinderella moment. Alexander's tastes tend to run toward more sophisticated women in the long term." The insult was delivered with surgical precision, designed to wound, while maintaining plausible deniability. Alexander saw Sophia flinch almost imperceptibly, and something dark and dangerous unfurled in his chest. "Get out," Alexander's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried enough menace to make Victor step back. "I beg your pardon?" I said. "Get out of my office now, before I have security escort you out and make sure everyone in this building knows exactly what kind of man you are." Victor's face flushed red with indignation. "Alexander, surely you're not going to let your little dalliance with the help cloud your judgment about important business relationships." "One more word," Alexander interrupted, his voice carrying the promise of violence, "and you'll be explaining to your investors why Kane Enterprises just canceled every contract we have with your company. Get out." The threat hit its mark. Victor's company depended heavily on the lucrative contracts with Kane Enterprises, and losing them would be catastrophic. After a moment of sputtering outrage, he turned and stalked out of the office, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, Alexander turned to find Sophia staring at him with wide eyes. Something like wonder mixed with confusion in her expression. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did." Alexander moved around her desk, kneeling beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Sophia, I need you to understand something. What Victor said, what he implied, none of it is true. You're not the help. You're not a dalliance, and you sure as hell aren't beneath anyone in this building or any other." Tears gathered in Sophia's eyes, though she blinked them back with characteristic strength. "Alexander, I'm not finished," he said gently, taking her hands in his. "You want to know what I really want? I want to take you to lunch at the most expensive restaurant in the city. I want to hold your hand while we walk through Pike Place Market. I want to spend hours talking to you about everything and nothing, learning all the things about you that I was too blind to see before." Sophia's breath caught, and Alexander saw the walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crack. "I want to bring you coffee every morning," he continued, his thumb stroking over her knuckles, "not because you're my assistant, but because I love the way you smile when you take that first sip. I want to ask your opinion about business decisions, because your mind is the sharpest I've ever encountered. I want to come home to you at the end of every day and fall asleep holding you in my arms." A single tear escaped to track down Sophia's cheek, and Alexander reached up to catch it with gentle fingers. "But mostly," he whispered, "I want you to believe that you deserve all of that and more. Because you do, Sophia. You deserve everything." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sound, the distant hum of the city, 42 floors below. Then Sophia smiled, really smiled with the radiance that had taken his breath away at the gala. "Lunch sounds nice," she said quietly, "though I should probably warn you that I have very strong opinions about seafood preparation." Alexander laughed, the sound rich with relief and joy. "I wouldn't expect anything less. But first, I believe I owe you a proper cup of coffee." As he stood to fulfill that promise, Alexander caught sight of the city skyline through his office windows. Seattle stretched out before them in all its rain-washed glory, full of possibility and promise. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Kane felt like he was exactly where he belonged, pursuing the most remarkable woman he'd ever met, ready to prove that he was worthy of her love. The chase was on, and Alexander intended to win it through grand gestures or expensive gifts, but by showing Sophia every day that she was the most precious thing in his world. Chapter 5. The Revelation. The emergency that shattered Alexander Kane's carefully ordered world arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Wednesday night in the form of a phone call that would have destroyed most companies and bankrupted lesser men. Alexander had been lying in bed in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling and thinking about Sophia, something that had become his primary occupation over the past 3 weeks. Their relationship had evolved into something beautiful and terrifying. A careful dance of professional boundaries and personal intimacy that left him constantly off balance and more alive than he'd ever felt. They'd had lunch at that expensive restaurant, where Sophia had indeed expressed strong opinions about the chef's heavy-handed approach to salmon preparation. They'd walked through Pike Place Market, her hand warm in his as she'd pointed out her favorite vendors and convinced him to try a dozen different samples of artisanal honey. They'd spent hours in his office after business hours, ostensibly reviewing quarterly reports, but actually talking about everything from her childhood in New Orleans to his complicated relationship with his late father. But they'd been so careful to maintain propriety during business hours. Sophia still called him Mr. Kane, in front of others, still maintained the professional demeanor that had defined their working relationship, and Alexander had respected her wishes, even as it killed him to pretend that the woman he was falling deeper in love with each day was nothing more than his very competent assistant. The phone rang with the harsh insistence of disaster, and Alexander answered without checking the caller ID. Kane. Alexander. Thank God. The voice belonged to Daniel Voss, Kane Enterprises' chief technology officer, and it carried the kind of panic that Alexander had learned to associate with catastrophic system failures. We've got a problem. A big one. Talk to me. The Yamamoto deal. Someone hacked our servers and stole the proprietary code for the new AI framework. Not only that, but they've leaked it to our 3 biggest competitors. The contract signing is supposed to happen in 6 hours, and if Yamamoto Industries finds out we've been compromised, Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of potential disaster settling on his shoulders. The Yamamoto deal was worth $400 million and represented Kane Enterprises' entry into the lucrative Asian technology market. Losing it wouldn't bankrupt the company, but it would be a devastating blow that would take years to recover from. How bad is the leak? Alexander asked, already reaching for his clothes. Complete system penetration. They got everything. Source code, financial projections, strategic plans, client lists. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. Alexander's jaw clenched as the implications hit him. This wasn't random corporate espionage. This was targeted, surgical, and timed for maximum damage. Someone with intimate knowledge of Kane Enterprises' operations had orchestrated this attack. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Alexander said, ending the call and grabbing his keys. The Kane Tower at midnight was a monument to ambition and insomnia. Its lower floors dark, while the upper executive levels blazed with emergency lighting. Alexander's private elevator carried him to the 42nd floor, where he found chaos barely contained by corporate professionalism. Daniel Voss looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past few hours, his usually perfect hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled from stress. Alexander, I've got the whole security team working on damage control. But? Alexander prompted. Though he could read the answer in Daniel's defeated expression. It's too late. The leak has already reached Croft Digital, Pinnacle Tech, and Morrison Industries. They're all scrambling to present competing offers to Yamamoto based on our stolen designs. Damian Croft. Alexander should have known his rival would be involved somehow, but even Damien wasn't foolish enough to orchestrate something this blatant without ironclad deniability. Sir, a voice from the outer office interrupted Alexander's thoughts, and he turned to find one of the night security guards looking apologetic, but determined. I tried to stop her. But she said you'd want to see her immediately. Before Alexander could ask who she was, Sophia appeared in the doorway, and Alexander's heart stopped. She was wearing jeans and an oversized sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face free of makeup. She looked younger, softer, and more beautiful than any woman had a right to look at midnight on a Tuesday. What are you doing here? Alexander asked, moving toward her instinctively. Daniel called me, Sophia replied, her eyes already scanning the chaos of printouts, laptops, and stress-fueled coffee cups that littered the office. He said there was a security breach involving the Yamamoto contract. Alexander turned to glare at his CTO. You called my assistant at midnight? She's the one who wrote half the proposal, Daniel said defensively. And she knows our security protocols better than anyone, except the IT department. I figured we needed all hands on deck. The admission hit Alexander like a physical blow. Sophia had been instrumental in the Yamamoto proposal. He'd known she was brilliant, had watched her handle complex negotiations and strategic planning with remarkable skill. But somehow, he'd never connected her daily contributions to the larger victories he'd been claiming credit for. The technical specifications and market analysis sections, Sophia continued, already moving toward one of the computers. You handled the financial negotiations and executive presentations. Alexander felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. For months, he'd been taking credit for a proposal that Sophia had largely created. Not only had he been blind to her personal worth, but he'd been professionally exploiting her genius without even realizing it. Sophia, he began, But she was already deep in concentration, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up files and cross-referenced security logs. The breach originated from an internal access point. She announced after several minutes of intense focus. Someone with high-level clearance uploaded a Trojan virus that created a backdoor into our most secure servers. That's impossible, Daniel protested. Only 5 people have access to those systems. Sophia's face was grim as she continued typing. 6 people, actually. You, Alexander, myself, Director Harlan from Legal, CFO Laura Benson, and Damien Croft. The silence that followed was deafening. Damien Croft had been granted temporary access to certain Kane Enterprises systems as part of a joint venture proposal that had ultimately been abandoned. The access should have been revoked months ago, but in the chaos of rapid corporate expansion, it had apparently slipped through the cracks. That son of a bitch, Alexander breathed, his hands clenching into fists. There's more, Sophia said quietly, her voice carrying a note that made Alexander's blood run cold. The breach happened at 3:17 m. on Monday, but the file access logs show that someone downloaded the complete Yamamoto proposal at 11:43 p.m. on Sunday night. Alexander felt the implications hit him like a freight train. Monday night was when we had dinner at Castellas. We were together until almost midnight, which means Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. Whoever did this knew exactly when you would be out of the office and unable to respond to security alerts. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Everyone in the room was looking at Sophia now, and Alexander could see the suspicion dawning in their faces. She was the only one who had known about his dinner plans. She was the only one who had been alone in the office that night after he left. You think I did this? Sophia's voice was steady, but Alexander could see the hurt and betrayal in her eyes as she looked around the room. Well, Daniel said carefully, you did have access to everything they stole, and you've been close to Alexander lately. Maybe Damien offered you something we couldn't match. That's enough. Alexander's voice cut through the speculation like a blade. Sophia didn't do this. Alexander, Daniel said gently, I know you care about her, but we have to consider all possibilities. The evidence is circumstantial, Alexander snapped. Sophia has been working 18-hour days for 2 years making this company successful. She saved us more money and prevented more disasters than any of you could even calculate. The idea that she would sabotage everything she's built is absurd. But even as he defended her, Alexander could see doubt creeping into the faces around him. The timing was suspicious, the access undeniable, and Sophia's recent relationship with Alexander provided potential motive for those inclined to conspiracy theories. I need to call my contact at Yamamoto Industries, Sophia said quietly, moving away from the computer. If we're going to salvage this deal, we need to get ahead of the story. No. Daniel stepped in front of her. I think it would be better if you stayed away from client communications until we sort this out. The insult was subtle but unmistakable. Daniel was treating Sophia like a suspect, and the rest of the team was following his lead. Alexander felt rage building in his chest, but before he could respond, Sophia spoke with quiet dignity. Of course, I understand. She turned to Alexander, and the hurt in her eyes made his heart break. I'll be at my desk if you need anything else. As Sophia walked out of the office, her spine straight and her head held high despite the suspicion surrounding her, Alexander felt something fundamental shift inside him. The woman he loved was being treated like a criminal by people who owed their success to her brilliance, and he was the only one who seemed to see the injustice of it. Get back to work, Alexander told the room at large. All of you, find out how Damien got access to our systems, and build me a timeline of exactly what was stolen and when. As the team dispersed to their various tasks, Alexander followed Sophia to her desk in the outer office. She was sitting in her chair, staring at her dark computer screen, with an expression of profound sadness. They think I betrayed you, she said without looking up. Alexander knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his, just as he had weeks ago when he'd first tried to show her how much she meant to him. I don't care what they think. I know who you are. Do you? Sophia's eyes met his, and Alexander saw vulnerability there that made his chest ache. Because right now, I feel like I don't know anything anymore. I feel like I've been living in a dream where I was more than just your assistant, where what we had was real and important and worth fighting for. It is real, Alexander said fiercely. What we have is the most real thing in my life. Sophia smiled sadly. Then why does it feel like it's falling apart? Alexander didn't have an answer for that. So instead, he did the only thing he could. He pulled her into his arms and held her while the city slept around them. And the crisis that would define their future continued to unfold. Whatever happened next, whatever damage Damien Croft's sabotage ultimately caused, Alexander knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would protect Sophia Hale with everything he had, even if it cost him his company and his reputation. Because somewhere between the first cup of coffee he'd brought her and this moment of quiet desperation in his office at 2 o'clock, Sophia had stopped being his assistant and become his heart. And Alexander Kane would be damned if he'd let anyone destroy that without a fight. Chapter 6. The First Kiss. 2 weeks after the Yamamoto crisis had been resolved salvaged through Sophia's brilliant damage control, and Alexander's ruthless legal maneuvering against Damien Croft, Alexander found himself staring out the window of a luxury SUV as it wound through the rolling hills of Napa Valley, wondering how he'd let himself be talked into a corporate retreat. The team needs this, Sophia had argued when she'd presented the proposal for a weekend getaway designed to rebuild morale and trust after the security breach. Everyone's been working around the clock. Tensions are high, and frankly, some people still have doubts about what really happened that night. She hadn't said that some people still suspected her of corporate espionage, but Alexander had heard it in the careful neutrality of her tone. The official investigation had cleared her completely. Security footage and digital forensics had proven that Damien Croft had indeed orchestrated the attack using his overlooked system access. But workplace rumors were harder to kill than cockroaches, and Alexander knew that Sophia still felt the sting of her colleagues' suspicion. Now, as their convoy of vehicles approached the Auberge du Soleil resort, Alexander caught sight of Sophia in the passenger seat of the lead car through the windshield. She was laughing at something their CFO had said, her face animated with genuine joy for the first time in weeks. The sight made his chest tight with emotions he was still learning to name. The resort was everything Alexander had expected from Sophia's impeccable planning. Elegant without being ostentatious, sophisticated enough to impress his executives, but intimate enough to encourage the team bonding she was hoping to achieve. Their suites were scattered throughout the property, connected by winding paths through olive groves and lavender fields that perfumed the October air. Mr. Kane, the resort manager, approached as Alexander climbed out of his vehicle. I'm terribly sorry, but there's been an issue with the room assignments. We had a last-minute cancellation from another corporate group, and their suite had a plumbing emergency. We're one room short for your party. Alexander felt his jaw clench. Trust a luxury resort to have plumbing problems when he needed everything to go smoothly. What are our options? Well, we do have one solution, the manager said carefully. Our vintage suite has 2 bedrooms with a shared living area. It's quite spacious, and the accommodations are our finest. If 2 members of your party wouldn't mind sharing the common space. Before Alexander could respond, Sophia appeared at his elbow, having overheard the conversation. That would be fine, she said with professional efficiency. Mr. Kane and I can share the suite. We often work late on business matters, so the shared space would actually be convenient. The casual way she'd volunteered to share accommodations with him sent heat shooting through Alexander's veins, though her tone suggested she viewed it as nothing more than a practical business arrangement, which, he reminded himself, was exactly how he should be viewing it as well. Perfect. The manager beamed with relief. I'll have your luggage sent up immediately. As the rest of the team scattered to their rooms to freshen up before the evening's wine tasting, Alexander found himself alone with Sophia for the first time since the crisis 2 weeks ago. Their relationship had been carefully professional since then, both of them seemingly determined to prove that their personal feelings wouldn't interfere with business operations. You don't have to do this, Alexander said as they walked toward their suite. I can sleep in the living room, or we can ask someone else to share accommodations. Sophia glanced at him with amusement. Alexander, we're both adults. I think we can manage to share a suite for 2 nights without the world ending. The vintage suite was, as promised, spectacular, Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the valley, where rolling hills covered in autumn vines stretched toward distant mountains. The living area was appointed with comfortable leather furniture and a stone fireplace, while French doors opened onto a private terrace, complete with a hot tub that steamed invitingly in the evening air. "This is beautiful," Sophia breathed, moving to the windows to take in the view. The setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, and the light turned her skin luminous. Alexander watched her instead of the scenery, noting the way the light caught in her hair and the graceful curve of her neck as she tilted her head to see the mountains in the distance. "Beautiful," he agreed, though he wasn't talking about the landscape. The wine tasting that evening was held in the resort's private cellar, where tables had been arranged among the oak barrels and stone archways. Alexander's team relaxed as the excellent vintages worked their magic, conversations becoming more animated and laughter more frequent as the evening progressed. Alexander found himself seated across from Sophia, watching as she charmed the sommelier with intelligent questions about terroir and fermentation techniques. She had changed into a flowing burgundy dress that complemented the wine country setting, and her hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders. "Miss Hale clearly has an appreciation for fine wine," commented Laura Benson, their CFO, as Sophia correctly identified notes of black currant and tobacco in a particularly complex Cabernet. "I spent a summer in France during college," Sophia explained, swirling her glass with practiced ease, "working harvest at a vineyard in Bordeaux. It was supposed to be a cultural exchange program, but I ended up learning more about wine production than French literature." Alexander felt a familiar pang at the realization that there were still so many things he didn't know about the woman he was falling deeper in love with each day. Every conversation revealed new depths to her intelligence and experience, reminders of how much of her life he'd ignored during their years of working together. "You never mentioned that," he said, aware that his colleagues were watching their interaction with interest. Sophia's smile was carefully neutral. "There are a lot of things about me you don't know, Mr. Kane." The formal address stung, especially since they were supposed to be relaxing and getting to know each other better as a team. But Alexander understood Herr Cochon. Their colleagues were still watching for signs of favoritism or impropriety, still judging whether Sophia's recent prominence in company operations was due to her abilities or her relationship with their boss. As the evening wound down and the team began to drift back to their rooms, Alexander found himself walking beside Sophia along the moonlit path to their suite. The October air was crisp but not cold, perfumed with the scent of eucalyptus and the distant smoke from someone's fireplace. "Thank you," Sophia said suddenly, her voice soft in the darkness. "For what?" "For defending me during the crisis. For never doubting me, even when the evidence looked suspicious." She paused, then added more quietly, "For believing in me when I wasn't sure I believed in myself." Alexander stopped walking, turning to face her in the dappled moonlight filtering through the olive trees. "Sophia, you saved that deal. If you hadn't figured out Damien's involvement and contacted Yamamoto Industries directly to explain the situation, we would have lost everything." "We would have lost everything," she corrected. "This company means as much to me as it does to you, Alexander. Maybe more. Because I've had to fight for every opportunity, every moment of recognition." The quiet pain in her voice made Alexander's chest ache. He reached out without thinking, his fingers ghosting along her cheek in a touch so light it might have been imagined. "You shouldn't have had to fight so hard," he said. "I should have seen your worth from the beginning." Sophia leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment before opening to meet his gaze. "We can't change the past." "No," Alexander agreed, stepping closer until he could smell her perfume, until he could see the gold flecks in her dark eyes. "But we can choose what happens next." The space between them seemed to shimmer with possibility and danger. They were alone in the moonlight, away from the office and the careful boundaries they'd maintained, surrounded by the intoxicating beauty of wine country and the lingering effects of excellent vintage. "Alexander," Sophia whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer and a warning combined. "I know we agreed to keep things professional," he said, his voice rough with want and uncertainty. "I know all the reasons why this is complicated, but Sophia, I can't pretend anymore that what I feel for you is simple or containable or appropriate." She searched his face in the moonlight, and Alexander held his breath as he waited for her response. He was balanced on a knife's edge between hope and heartbreak, between the safe distance they'd maintained and the terrifying intimacy he craved. "What do you feel for me?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible above the distant sound of wind through the vines. Alexander cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs tracing the elegant line of her cheekbones. "I feel like I've been sleepwalking through my life until I met you. I feel like every success I've achieved means nothing without someone to share it with. I feel like you've become the center of my world without me even noticing it happening." Tears gathered in Sophia's eyes, though she didn't let them fall. "That's a lot of feeling for someone you barely noticed for 2 years." "I noticed," Alexander admitted with painful honesty. "I noticed how brilliant you were, how graceful, how you made everything in my life run smoothly. I just convinced myself that acknowledging it would complicate things. I was a coward who hid behind professional boundaries because I was terrified of what you made me feel. And now," Sophia's hands came up to rest against his chest, her palms warm through the fabric of his shirt. "Now I'm still terrified," Alexander said with a laugh that held no humor. "But I'm more afraid of losing you than I am of facing what's between us." Sophia rose on her tiptoes, eliminating the last inches of distance between them. "Then stop being afraid," she whispered against his lips. Their first real kiss was nothing like the sweet, tentative touch they'd shared on the terrace at the Gala. This was desperate and hungry, 2 weeks of careful restraint dissolving in the space of a heartbeat. Alexander's arms came around her, pulling her against him as if he could somehow merge their bodies through sheer force of will. Sophia's hands fisted in his shirt, anchoring herself as the world tilted around them. She tasted like wine and possibility, like everything Alexander had been searching for without knowing it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the moonlight revealed faces flushed with passion and wonder. "This changes everything," Sophia said, her voice shaky but certain. "I know." Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face as if she might disappear if he let go. "Are you ready for that?" Sophia smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. "I've been ready for 2 years. The question is whether you're ready to stop treating me like your assistant and start treating me like your equal." "More than equal," Alexander said fiercely. "You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known, and I intend to spend as long as it takes proving that I'm worthy of you." As they walked the rest of the way to their suite, hands clasped together in the moonlight, Alexander felt like everything in his life had finally clicked into place. The careful distance they'd maintained was gone, replaced by something real and deep and infinitely precious. Tomorrow, they would return to Seattle and face the challenges of navigating a relationship under the scrutiny of colleagues and competitors. But tonight, in the romantic beauty of Napa Valley with the woman he loved finally in his arms, Alexander Kane felt like the luckiest man alive. Chapter 7. The Sabotage. The malicious whispers began on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Alexander and Sophia had returned from Napa Valley. Glowing with newfound love and carefully hidden happiness, Alexander should have known that their secret couldn't last forever in the fishbowl environment of corporate Seattle, where gossip traveled faster than stock prices and relationships were dissected with the ruthless precision of quarterly earnings reports. He'd been vigilant about maintaining professional boundaries during business hours, but love had a way of revealing itself in subtle gestures. The way his hand lingered when passing documents, how his voice softened when addressing her in meetings, the protective stance he unconsciously adopted whenever other men spoke to her. But he'd been so intoxicated by the joy of finally being with Sophia that he'd ignored the warning signs, the speculative glances from colleagues, the sudden silences when he entered rooms, the way conversations seemed to pivot whenever Sophia's recent promotion to business development director was mentioned. The promotion had been long overdue, a formal recognition of contributions she'd been making for years without proper acknowledgement or compensation. Alexander had announced it with professional pride, detailing her innovative strategies for the Asian market expansion and her instrumental role in salvaging the Yamamoto deal. Every word had been true, every accolade earned through brilliance and dedication. But corporate America had a way of twisting truth into something ugly, and Alexander was about to learn exactly how devastating that transformation could be. He was reviewing quarterly projections in his office when his phone buzzed with a text from Daniel Voss. "We need to talk. Conference room B now." The urgency in the message made Alexander's stomach clench with familiar dread. Daniel only used that tone when delivering catastrophic news. and Alexander couldn't think of any current crisis that warranted such secrecy. Conference Room B was tucked away on the 39th floor, far from the executive suite and the curious ears that seemed to multiply whenever sensitive discussions were needed. Alexander found Daniel there, along with Laura Benson and Director of Human Resources Amanda Patel, their faces wearing the carefully neutral expressions of people about to destroy someone's life. "What's this about?" Alexander asked, settling into his chair with the controlled calm he'd perfected during decades of high-stakes negotiations. Amanda slid a manila folder across the polished table toward him. "We've received some concerning allegations that require immediate attention." Alexander opened the folder and felt the blood drain from his face. Inside were printed emails, text message, screenshots, and what appeared to be security camera stills from various locations around the building, but it was the cover letter that made his hands shake with rage. The document was typed on expensive letterhead belonging to Damian Croft's law firm, and it detailed allegations of sexual harassment, workplace favoritism, and abuse of power. According to the meticulously crafted narrative, Alexander had been coercing sexual favors from his assistant in exchange for professional advancement, creating a hostile work environment through quid pro quo harassment and violating company policies regarding romantic relationships between supervisors and subordinates. "This is bullshit," Alexander said, his voice deadly quiet. "Complete, malicious lies designed to destroy both my reputation and Sophia's career." "We understand your position," Laura said carefully, "but we have to investigate these allegations thoroughly. The evidence presented is substantial." Alexander looked at the doctored photographs again, seeing how cleverly they'd been selected and edited. An image of him placing his hand on Sophia's back as they entered a restaurant became evidence of inappropriate touching. A photo of them standing close together in his office was presented as proof of improper behavior during business hours. Even their innocent lunch meetings had been documented and twisted into evidence of misconduct. "Where did this come from?" Alexander demanded, though he already knew the answer. "The complaint was filed anonymously," Amanda replied, "but the accompanying evidence suggests someone with intimate knowledge of your daily routines and access to building security footage. Damian Croft." It had to be Damian. Striking back after his failed attempt at corporate espionage had cost him several lucrative contracts and his reputation among Seattle's business elite. But Damian was too smart to attack Alexander directly. Instead, he'd chosen to target the woman Alexander loved. Knowing that destroying Sophia would be the cruelest possible revenge, "I want to see Miss Hale immediately," Alexander said, starting to rise from his chair. "That's not advisable," Amanda said quickly. "Given the nature of these allegations, any contact between you and Miss Hale during the investigation could be viewed as intimidation or further evidence of inappropriate behavior." The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow. Not only was Damian trying to destroy Sophia's career, but he'd also effectively isolated her from the one person who could defend her. Alexander was trapped by the very policies designed to protect employees from actual harassment. "How long will this investigation take?" Alexander asked, his voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure. 4 to 6 weeks, minimum," Laura replied. "During that time, Miss Hale will be placed on administrative leave with full pay and will need you to refrain from any contact with her outside of official company business." Administrative leave. The words were corporate speak for professional exile, a gentle way of removing someone from the workplace while their reputation was systematically destroyed. Alexander knew that, regardless of the investigation's outcome, the mere fact that allegations had been made would follow Sophia for the rest of her career. "This is exactly what Damian Croft wanted," Alexander said, his anger finally breaking through his professional restraint. "He's using our own policies as weapons against us." "Mr. Kane," Amanda's voice carried a warning edge, "I strongly advise you not to make accusations without evidence. The investigation will be thorough and impartial, and the truth will emerge." But Alexander knew better. Corporate investigations were designed to protect companies, not individuals. Even if Sophia was completely exonerated, the whispers would follow her forever. People would always wonder if she'd really earned her success or simply slept her way to the top. The meeting ended with Alexander feeling like he'd been flayed alive. He returned to his office to find Sophia's desk empty. her personal belongings already packed into a box that sat on her chair like an accusation. The sight made his chest constrict with rage and helplessness. His phone rang, and Alexander answered without checking the caller ID, hoping against hope that it might be Sophia. "Alexander, my boy." Damien Croft's voice oozed false sympathy through the speaker. "I heard about your little personnel problem. Such a shame when workplace relationships become complicated. You son of a—" Alexander snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility. "You orchestrated this entire thing." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." Damien replied with obvious satisfaction. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised you were so careless, dating your assistant." "Really, Alexander? It's such a cliché." "And poor Miss Hale. Such a promising career cut short by scandal. One has to wonder if she'll ever recover from something like this." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Damien wasn't just attacking their relationship, he was threatening to destroy Sophia's professional future entirely. Alexander could weather a scandal. He had money, connections, and a reputation built over decades. But Sophia was vulnerable in ways that made Alexander's protective instincts scream with fury. "What do you want?" Alexander asked, his voice barely controlled. "Nothing dramatic," Damien said airily. "Perhaps a few strategic contract cancellations. Maybe you could reconsider that patent dispute we've been having. Small gestures of goodwill between colleagues. And if I refuse? Well, investigations can be so unpredictable. Evidence has a way of surfacing at inconvenient times. Witnesses sometimes remember details they'd previously forgotten. You never know what might emerge during a thorough examination of workplace relationships." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the trap closing around him. Damien had engineered a perfect checkmate. Alexander could sacrifice his business interests to protect Sophia, or he could fight back and risk even more damaging revelations being manufactured. "I need time to consider your suggestions," Alexander said finally. "Of course, take all the time you need," Damien replied, his tone dripping with mock generosity. "Though I wouldn't wait too long. Reputations are such fragile things, and once they're damaged, they're nearly impossible to repair." The line went dead, leaving Alexander alone in his office with the taste of defeat in his mouth. Through his windows, Seattle sprawled below him in all its rain-soaked glory, indifferent to the personal catastrophe unfolding 42 stories above the street. Alexander tried calling Sophia, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried texting, but received no response. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her apartment, to explain what was happening, and plan their defense together. But he knew that any contact would only provide more ammunition for Damien's attack. As the day wore on, Alexander watched his company begin to fracture under the weight of whispered rumors and speculation. Employees clustered in hallways, their conversations stopping abruptly when he passed. Clients called with carefully worded concerns about workplace stability and leadership accountability. Business partners began distancing themselves from potential scandal. By evening, Alexander understood exactly what Damien had accomplished. This wasn't just an attack on Alexander and Sophia's relationship. It was a systematic assault on everything they'd built together. Damien had weaponized society's double standards about powerful men and ambitious women, turning their love into something tawdry and transactional. Alexander stood in his empty office as darkness fell over the city, surrounded by the empire he'd spent his life building, but feeling utterly powerless to protect the one person who mattered most. Somewhere in the city below, Sophia was facing this nightmare alone, probably believing that Alexander had abandoned her to save his own reputation. The thought of her sitting in her apartment, surrounded by packed boxes and shattered dreams, filled Alexander with a rage so pure it took his breath away. Damien Croft had made one crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that Alexander would choose his business over his heart. But as Alexander stared out at the city lights, a cold determination settled over him like armor. Damien wanted a war. He was about to get one, and Alexander Kane was prepared to burn down everything he'd built if that's what it took to protect the woman he loved. The battle lines were drawn, and Alexander had no intention of losing the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him. Chapter 8. The Dark Period. 3 months after Sophia Hale disappeared from Alexander Kane's life, Seattle felt like a city of ghosts, every street corner holding memories that cut him like broken glass. standing in his penthouse at 2 o'clock. A tumbler of 30-year-old scotch untouched in his hand, he stared out at the city lights that had once symbolized possibility and ambition. Now they looked like funeral pyres, flickering reminders of everything he'd lost through his own cowardice and pride. The official investigation had concluded after 6 weeks, finding no evidence of harassment or misconduct. The allegations had been revealed as fabricated, the evidence doctored, the anonymous complaint traced back to sources connected to Damien Croft's organization. Sophia had been completely exonerated, her reputation officially cleared, and offered full reinstatement with a substantial salary increase and public apology. But the damage had already been done. During those 6 weeks of administrative leave, while Alexander had been legally prevented from contacting her, Sophia had watched from the sidelines as her colleagues whispered and speculated. She'd endured the humiliation of having her professional relationships scrutinized and her personal life dissected by strangers. Most devastating of all, she'd waited for Alexander to break protocol, to fight the system, to choose her over corporate procedure, and he hadn't. Alexander had followed the rules, trusting that legal vindication would be enough to heal the wounds Damien's attack had inflicted. But vindication couldn't erase the memory of sitting alone in her apartment, wondering if the man she loved would prioritize her heart over his company's liability concerns. When the offer of reinstatement came, Sophia had already accepted the truth. Alexander would always choose the safe, strategic path over the bold gesture of love she needed. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been so focused on protecting her from Damien's machinations that he'd failed to protect her from the one thing that could truly destroy her, his own inability to fight for their love when it mattered most. The weeks following the scandal had been a masterclass in corporate damage control. Alexander's legal team had dismantled Damien's attack with surgical precision, exposing the fabricated evidence and threatening lawsuits that would have bankrupted lesser men. Damien himself had retreated in defeat, his reputation in ruins, his business empire crumbling under the weight of his own malicious schemes. But Alexander's victory felt hollow as ashes. He'd won the war but lost the only battle that mattered, the fight for Sophia's trust and heart. The sound of his phone ringing cut through the silence of his penthouse, and Alexander glanced at the screen with the weary resignation of a man who no longer expected good news. Daniel Voss's name appeared, and Alexander considered ignoring it entirely. His CTO had been treating him with kid gloves for weeks, tiptoeing around conversations that might trigger Alexander's increasingly volatile temper. "What is it, Daniel?" Alexander answered, not bothering to hide his irritation. "I found here." The words hit Alexander like an electric shock, and the scotch glass slipped from his nerveless fingers to shatter on the marble floor. "What did you say?" "Sophia. I found her. She's in New Orleans." "And Alexander, she started her own company." "New Orleans." Of course, she'd gone home to the city that had shaped her strength and resilience, the place where she could rebuild her life away from the toxic atmosphere of Seattle's corporate scene. Alexander closed his eyes, picturing her in the sultry embrace of the French Quarter, surrounded by the music and culture that had formed her beautiful soul. "Tell me everything," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotions he'd been suppressing for months. "Hale Strategies. She specializes in corporate crisis management and strategic development. According to my sources, she's already landed several major clients, including 2 Fortune 500 companies that were impressed by her handling of our Yamamoto situation. Word travels fast in crisis management circles, and her reputation for discretion and results is spreading throughout the Gulf Coast business community." Alexander felt a surge of pride cut through his despair. Of course, Sophia was succeeding. Her brilliance couldn't be contained by scandal or geography, and she was too strong to let Damien Croft's attack define her future. Is there anyone? Alexander couldn't finish the question, but Daniel understood. "No romantic attachments that I could find. She's been focused entirely on building her business." The relief that flooded through Alexander was immediate and overwhelming. He'd spent countless sleepless nights imagining Sophia in someone else's arms, finding comfort with a man who had appreciated her from the beginning instead of taking years to recognize her worth. "I want her address," Alexander said, already moving toward his bedroom to pack. "Alexander, wait." Daniel's voice carried a warning that made him pause. "There's something else you need to know. I reached out to her through mutual contacts, tried to explain what really happened with the investigation, how we proved Damien orchestrated everything, and she knows. She's known for weeks. But Alexander, she doesn't want to see you. She's made it clear that she considers that chapter of her life closed. The words were like a knife to Alexander's heart, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed how little Sophia believed in her own worth. Wait, no. She knew he'd been vindicated, knew that Damien's attack had been exposed and defeated, but she still didn't want him in her life. Did she say why? Alexander asked, feeling his legs go weak. She said you had your chance to fight for her when it mattered, and you chose your reputation over her heart. She said she couldn't be with someone who would abandon her the moment things got difficult. Alexander closed his eyes, remembering those awful weeks when corporate policy had prevented him from contacting Sophia directly, when every instinct had screamed at him to ignore the rules and go to her anyway. He'd told himself he was being strategic, that following proper procedures would ultimately protect her. But Sophia had seen his caution as abandonment, his strategic thinking as cowardice. And she wasn't wrong. She's not going to give you another chance, Daniel continued gently. I'm sorry, Alexander, but I think you need to accept that and move on. Move on? As if Alexander could simply forget the woman who had become the center of his universe, who had shown him what love really meant, who had made him want to be better than he'd ever imagined possible. Get me her address anyway, Alexander said quietly. Alex, get me her address, Daniel. That's not a request. After Daniel hung up, Alexander stood in his silent penthouse and began to plan. He couldn't call Sophia or text her, couldn't send flowers or gifts that could be easily ignored or returned. If he was going to reach her, it would have to be through actions, not words. He would have to prove that he'd learned from his mistakes, that he was finally ready to fight for their love with the same ruthless determination he brought to everything else. Over the following weeks, Alexander threw himself into a campaign more complex and challenging than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. Working through intermediaries and shell companies, he began quietly investing in New Orleans businesses, particularly those owned by women and minorities. He established a scholarship fund at Tulane University in honor of Sophia's late father, a professor who had instilled in her the love of learning that had shaped her brilliant mind. Alexander donated anonymously to hurricane relief efforts, funded small business loans for entrepreneurs in underserved communities, and sponsored arts programs in the Ninth Ward. Every action was designed to make New Orleans a better place, the kind of city where someone like Sophia could thrive and build the life she deserved. But even as Alexander poured his resources into these efforts, he knew they were just the foundation of a larger campaign. Money could solve many problems, but it couldn't repair the damage he'd done to Sophia's trust. For that, he would need something much more precious and difficult to give, his complete vulnerability and willingness to risk everything for love. The phone rang again, interrupting his brooding. This time it was Amanda Patel from Human Resources, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering potentially explosive news. Alexander, we've received an interesting call. Sophia Hale's attorney contacted us about the non-compete clause in her employment contract. Alexander felt his heart skip a beat. Sophia was making a move, and he couldn't predict what it might be. What about the non-compete? She's arguing that the hostile work environment created by Damien Croft's attack voided the contract. She wants to be released from all restrictions so she can pursue clients in markets where we're active. The legal maneuvering was to free Sophia to compete directly with Kane Enterprises while simultaneously establishing a public record of the damage Damien's attack had caused. But more importantly, it was a message meant specifically for Alexander. Sophia was telling him that she was strong enough to stand against him professionally, that she didn't need his protection or his guilt-driven largesse. Grant her request, Alexander said immediately. Full release from all contractual obligations, and make sure she gets a formal apology from the company for the way the situation was handled. Alexander, are you sure? This could open us up to significant competition. I'm sure. Do it today. As Alexander hung up the phone, he felt something shift inside him. A crystallization of purpose that cut through months of despair and self-recrimination. Sophia was fighting back, reclaiming her power and independence with the same quiet strength that had first attracted him. She was showing him exactly what kind of man she needed, not someone who would try to shield her from the world, but someone who would stand beside her as an equal and trust her to handle whatever challenges came her way. For the first time in months, Alexander Kane smiled. The woman he loved was giving him one final chance to prove himself worthy of her, though she probably didn't even realize it. And this time, he wasn't going to let fear or pride or strategic thinking get in the way of the most important fight of his life. The campaign for Sophia's heart was about to begin in earnest, and Alexander intended to win it through grand gestures or expensive gifts, but by becoming the man she'd always needed him to be. Chapter 9. The Grand Gesture. 9 months after Sophia Hale had been forced out of his life, Alexander Kane stood in the boardroom of Kane Enterprises and did something that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He began dismantling his empire piece by carefully calculated piece. Gentlemen, ladies, Alexander addressed his board of directors, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern as they reviewed the documents he'd presented. What you're looking at is a complete restructuring proposal that will fundamentally alter the nature of this company. Laura Benson, his CFO, looked up from the financial projections with barely concealed alarm. Alexander, this plan would reduce your controlling interest to less than 30%. You'd essentially be giving away billions in assets. I'm aware of the financial implications, he replied calmly, though his heart was racing with the magnitude of what he was proposing. But I believe this restructuring represents our best path forward for sustainable growth and social responsibility. The plan Alexander had spent months developing was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. He was proposing to donate 70% of his personal stake in Kane Enterprises to a charitable foundation focused on education, small business development, and disaster relief, primarily in underserved communities throughout the Gulf Coast region. The remaining 30% would be restructured as employee ownership shares, giving every worker in the company a stake in its success. This is corporate suicide, muttered Harold Black, the board's longest-serving member. What's brought on this sudden attack of philanthropy? Alexander had been preparing for this question for weeks, crafting answers that were truthful without revealing the desperate personal motivation behind his actions. I've come to realize that wealth without purpose is meaningless. Kane Enterprises has the opportunity to become a force for positive change, not just another tech company focused solely on profit maximization. What he didn't say was that every decision had been shaped by months of painful self-reflection and a single driving question: what would make Sophia proud? The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had begun with small changes, actually listening to his employees' concerns, researching the social impact of his business decisions, seeking mentorship from leaders who prioritized purpose alongside profit. Every charitable initiative, every community investment, every policy change had been designed not just to improve the world, but to prove that Alexander Kane had finally internalized the lessons she'd been trying to teach him for years. The board meeting stretched for 4 hours, filled with heated discussions about fiduciary responsibility and shareholder value. But Alexander had done his homework meticulously, consulting with the best legal and financial minds money could buy. He'd structured the plan to actually increase long-term shareholder value through improved ESG ratings, tax benefits, and enhanced corporate reputation. The restructuring was not only legal but strategically sound, positioning Kane Enterprises as a leader in corporate social responsibility while maintaining its competitive edge in an increasingly socially conscious marketplace. When the final vote was taken, Alexander's proposal passed by a narrow margin of 6-5, setting in motion the largest voluntary wealth redistribution in corporate history. As the board members filed out, their faces wearing expressions ranging from admiration to bewilderment, Alexander allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Phase 2 was more personal and infinitely more terrifying. Alexander had spent months learning everything he could about Sophia's new life in New Orleans. Through discreet inquiries and careful observation, he discovered that she was not only succeeding professionally, but thriving personally. Hale Strategies had become one of the most respected crisis management firms in the South, with a client list that included major corporations and municipal governments throughout the region. More importantly, Sophia had become deeply involved in her community. She volunteered at literacy programs in the lower Ninth Ward, served on the board of a nonprofit focused on hurricane preparedness, and had quietly funded the renovation of her old elementary school. She was using her success to lift up the community that had shaped her, embodying the values of service and compassion that Alexander had been too blind to appreciate during their years of working together. But it was the scholarship program that had given Alexander his opening. The Hale Lambert Educational Foundation, named for Sophia's late parents, provided full tuition support for academically gifted students from low-income families. He'd learned about it through his own charitable research. And after careful investigation, he'd made a strategic decision that would either open the door to reconciliation or close it forever. The anonymous donation had been substantial enough to fully endow the foundation for decades to come, ensuring that hundreds of students would receive the educational opportunities Sophia believed everyone deserved. He had included a single condition: the donor's identity would remain secret unless Sophia specifically requested disclosure. For 6 weeks, Alexander had waited for some response, some sign that Sophia had connected the dots between the massive donation and the restructuring of Kane Enterprises that had made international news, but her silence had been absolute, leaving Alexander to wonder if his gesture had been too subtle or if Sophia simply didn't care about his attempts at redemption. Then, on a rainy Thursday morning, his phone rang with a number he recognized from months of memorization, Sophia's direct line at Hale Strategies. "This is Alexander," he answered, his voice carefully controlled despite the way his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Hello, Alexander." Sophia's voice was exactly as he remembered, warm and professional, with an undertone of steel that had always taken his breath away. "I believe we need to talk." The simple statement contained multitudes. Alexander had been preparing for this conversation for months, crafting arguments and explanations and apologies, but now that the moment had arrived, all his careful preparation crumbled into dust. "Yes," he said simply, "we do. I assume you're familiar with the recent donation to my foundation." "I may have heard something about it," Alexander replied, not quite ready to admit his involvement without understanding her reaction. There was a pause, and Alexander could picture Sophia sitting at her desk in her New Orleans office, probably wearing one of those elegant but professional dresses that had always made him forget whatever he'd been thinking about. The mental image was so vivid it made his chest ache with longing. The donor's lawyers were very careful to maintain anonymity. Sophia continued, "But there are certain patterns in the paperwork that remind me of someone I used to know, someone with a particular fondness for complex legal structures and unnecessarily elaborate corporate maneuvering." Despite everything, Alexander found himself smiling. Trust Sophia to see through his carefully constructed anonymity. She'd always been too intelligent to fool, even when he'd been arrogant enough to try. "And if this someone you used to know was hypothetically involved in the donation," Alexander asked carefully, "what would you want to know?" "Why?" Sophia's voice carried no emotion he could identify, not anger, not gratitude, nothing that would give him a clue about what she was thinking. "Why now, after all this time? Why this particular cause?" Alexander closed his eyes, knowing that this was the moment where everything would be decided. He could give her a diplomatic answer, something about corporate social responsibility and tax advantages. Or he could tell her the truth and risk having his heart broken beyond repair. "Because I finally understand what you were trying to teach me," he said quietly. "That success without purpose is meaningless. That power without compassion is just sophisticated bullying. That love without action is just pretty words." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of months of separation and years of misunderstanding. Alexander held his breath, waiting for Sophia's response and praying that he hadn't waited too long to learn the lessons she'd been offering all along. "I see," Sophia said finally, and Alexander caught something in her voice that might have been surprise or might have been hope. "And you thought funding my foundation would demonstrate this newfound understanding?" "I thought it might be a start," Alexander admitted, "along with restructuring my entire company to prioritize social responsibility over profit maximization, and publicly acknowledging that Damien Croft's attack was successful because I was too much of a coward to fight for you when it mattered." Another pause, this one shorter but somehow more intense. "You made that acknowledgement publicly in the Wall Street Journal, Fortune magazine, and Harvard Business Review. I figured if I was going to admit to being an idiot, I might as well do it comprehensively." For the first time since the conversation began, Alexander heard something that might have been laughter in Sophia's voice. "That must have been humbling for someone with your ego." "Devastating," Alexander agreed. but nowhere near as humbling as realizing I'd lost the most important thing in my life because I was too proud to admit I needed help learning how to love someone properly. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and completely vulnerable. Alexander had just handed Sophia the power to destroy him with a few words, and they both knew it. "Alexander," Sophia said softly, and the way she said his name made his heart skip a beat. "What exactly are you asking for?" "A chance," Alexander replied without hesitation. "Not to go back to what we had, because I know that's impossible. But a chance to show you who I've become, who you inspired me to be. A chance to prove that I'm finally ready to love you the way you've always deserved." The silence that followed was the longest of Alexander's life. Through his office windows, Seattle sprawled below him in all its rain-soaked glory, but Alexander barely saw it. His entire world had narrowed to the phone in his hand and the woman on the other end of the line who held his future in her voice. "I'll think about it," Sophia said finally, and Alexander felt hope bloom in his chest like a flower after a long winter. "But Alexander, if I give you this chance, if I let you back into my life, there won't be another one. This is it. Everything or nothing." "I understand," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "And Sophia, thank you for even considering it. For being willing to believe that people can change." "People can change," Sophia agreed quietly. "The question is whether they change enough, and whether they change in time. I guess we'll find out." As the line went dead, Alexander set his phone down with shaking hands and allowed himself to believe for the first time in months that love might be enough after all. Chapter 10. The Reunion. The sultry New Orleans evening wrapped around Alexander Kane like a living thing as he stood at the entrance to the French Quarter courtyard, where Sophia's life had been reborn without him. 2 years had passed since their phone conversation, 2 years of the most excruciating patience Alexander had ever endured. True to her word, Sophia had thought about his request for a second chance. She'd thought about it for over a year and a half, during which Alexander had proven his transformation through actions rather than words, building a reputation for corporate responsibility that had fundamentally altered how business was conducted in Seattle. But thinking was not the same as deciding, and Sophia Hale had become a master of keeping her own counsel. Tonight marked the second anniversary of Hale Strategies, and Alexander had received an invitation that had arrived without explanation or context, just elegant script on cream-colored paper bearing the address and time. Whether it was an invitation to reconciliation or a final goodbye, Alexander couldn't tell. But he'd flown to New Orleans anyway, because the alternative was living the rest of his life wondering what might have been. The courtyard was transformed into something from a fairy tale, with Spanish moss draped in twinkling lights and jazz music drifting from a small ensemble in the corner. Magnolia blossoms perfumed the air, and the soft glow of lanterns cast everything in warm, romantic light. The crowd was a mixture of New Orleans society and business professionals, all celebrating the remarkable woman who had built something beautiful from the ashes of her shattered dreams. And there she was. Sophia moved through her guests like a queen holding court, radiant in an emerald dress that made her skin glow like burnished gold. She was even more beautiful than Alexander remembered, if such a thing were possible. Success had given her an additional layer of confidence, a regal bearing that spoke of a woman who had faced the worst and emerged stronger than ever. Alexander's hands shook as he watched her laugh at something a distinguished older gentleman was saying, her joy so genuine and infectious that everyone around her seemed to lean closer, drawn by her magnetic warmth. "You've got some nerve showing up here." Alexander turned to find a petite woman with fierce eyes and protective energy radiating from every pore. This had to be Zoe, Sophia's best friend and self-appointed guardian angel. Alexander had heard about her from their mutual contacts, a successful attorney who had no patience for men who broke her best friend's heart. "Zoe, I presume," Alexander said, offering a slight bow. "Sophia's spoken of you often. Has she now?" Zoe's tone could have frozen the Mississippi River. "Funny, because she hasn't spoken of you at all. Not once in the past 2 years." The words hit their mark with surgical precision, but Alexander had expected them. He'd known that coming here would mean facing the protective fury of everyone who loved Sophia, everyone who had witnessed her pain and helped her rebuild her life. "I don't blame her," Alexander said quietly. "Or you, for wanting to protect her from me." Damn right, I want to protect her. Zoe stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. Do you have any idea what you put her through? Do you know how many nights I held her while she cried over a man who was too much of a coward to fight for her? Each word was a knife to Alexander's heart, but he accepted the pain as his due. I know, and I'll regret that cowardice for the rest of my life. Regret isn't enough, Zoe said flatly. Sophia deserves better than pretty apologies and guilt-driven grand gestures. You're right, Alexander agreed, his eyes finding Sophia across the courtyard again. She deserves everything. Before Zoe could respond, a hush fell over the gathering as Sophia stepped onto a small platform near the fountain. The fairy lights caught in her hair like captured starlight, and when she spoke, her voice carried the warm honey of her Louisiana roots, mixed with the confidence of hard-won success. Thank you all for being here tonight, she began, her smile encompassing the entire gathering. 2 years ago, I came home to New Orleans with nothing but a broken heart and a determination to build something meaningful. Tonight, we celebrate not just the success of Hale's strategies, but the power of community, resilience, and the courage to begin again. Alexander felt his breath catch at the phrase second chances, though he couldn't tell if it was directed at him or spoken in general terms. This company exists because of the people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, Sophia continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. My mama, who taught me that grace under pressure is the greatest strength any woman can possess. My dear friend Zoe, who reminded me that I was worthy of love and respect, even when I'd forgotten it myself. And all of you who trusted a woman starting over to help you solve your most complex challenges. As Sophia spoke about gratitude and growth, Alexander felt the weight of every mistake he'd made settling on his shoulders. She'd built this beautiful life, surrounded herself with people who cherished her, created a business that reflected her values of service and excellence. What right did he have to disrupt her peace with his belated realization of her worth? But tonight isn't just about looking back. Sophia's voice drew Alexander from his self-recrimination. It's about looking forward to the challenges and opportunities that await us. Because I've learned that sometimes the greatest growth comes from facing the things that scare us most. Her eyes found his across the courtyard, and Alexander felt the world stop spinning. In that moment, with fairy lights dancing around her and the soft New Orleans night wrapping them both in possibility, Alexander saw something in Sophia's gaze that made his heart race with desperate hope. Recognition, invitation, and perhaps, if he wasn't imagining it, forgiveness. The speech ended to thunderous applause. And Alexander watched as Sophia was immediately surrounded by well-wishers and admirers. He hung back, uncertain whether to approach or give her space, when he felt a hand on his arm. She knew you were coming, Zoe said quietly. Her hostile demeanor softened into something that might have been resignation. She's known for weeks. The invitation wasn't an accident. Alexander's heart leaped. Then why? Because she needed to see if you'd come anyway, even knowing you might be walking into a room full of people who hate you for hurting her. She needed to know if you'd risk public humiliation for the chance to see her again. I'd risk everything for her, Alexander said simply. I thought I'd proven that by now. Actions prove things, Zoe agreed. But tonight is about something different. Tonight is about whether you've learned to be vulnerable, to admit when you're wrong, to put her happiness above your own pride. As if summoned by their conversation, Sophia appeared at Alexander's side with the fluid grace that had always taken his breath away. Up close, she was even more magnificent, her skin glowing with health and happiness, her eyes bright with intelligence and something that might have been mischief. Hello, Alexander, she said, her voice carrying the familiar professional warmth that had once driven him mad with longing. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me, Alexander replied, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Though I wasn't sure if it was an invitation or a test, Sophia's smile was enigmatic. Can't it be both? The simple question contained multitudes, and Alexander realized that this was indeed a test, perhaps the most important one of his life. Not a test of his wealth or power or ability to make grand gestures, but a test of his character, his growth, his willingness to be the man she needed rather than the man he'd always been. Yes, Alexander said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. It can be both. And for what it's worth, I hope I pass. We'll see, Sophia replied. But there was warmth in her voice that made Alexander's chest tight with hope. We'll see. The night was young, filled with music and laughter and the intoxicating promise of new beginnings. And as Alexander followed Sophia deeper into the celebration of her remarkable life, he realized that he was no longer the arrogant businessman who had once thought love could be conquered like a corporate takeover. He was just a man, humbled and hopeful, ready to prove that sometimes the greatest victory was learning to surrender your heart completely to the person who had always deserved it.